Welcome again to the program. Ken, how are you?
Good to be with you, Glenn. I'm doing well. Thank you.
I wanted to talk to you about Portland and this shooting. I think this was an execution that happened in Portland, and by a really, really bad guy, apparently. Can you tell us what we know about the alleged shooter?
Well, it is preliminary, and it's a messy situation. The investigation has just begun, and one of the tough things about this sort of a situation, especially for us Americans, is, we're so antsy and impatient. We want everything done yesterday.
Right.
But to do an investigation correctly does take some time. But the initial person of interest is clearly someone with a track record, and
Yeah.
a gentle way to put it. And, when you invite and frankly encourage violence for months at a time, what you get is violence. And you also, and frankly, in some respects, it took longer than I thought it would, you invite in other elements, and I don't mean necessarily bad, people who are just fed up, who are so frustrated with the failure of the rule of law that they want to go do it themselves. And historically, we've called them vigilantes. But the reality is, America policed itself for the first 100 years of its existence. Right? There were no police. There was you and me in our neighborhoods, and that attitude, that cultural element, has never left us completely. And when people like the mayor of Portland intentionally decline to adequately police their own communities, you invite more violence in. Violence begets violence. It doesn't burn itself out. And we've seen that all over the country, the obvious comparison being Kenosha, where a somewhat reluctant Governor Evers did bring in National Guard, small amounts at first. But when he finally put enough people there, after some more violence happened, the president had urged him to do so. Peace broke out and has remained in Kenosha. This is the peace through strength concept that Ronald Reagan made famous in international relations, simply applied to domestic tranquility. And that's the goal. It's the goal of the president. It's the goal of many people, but apparently not the mayor of Portland or the governor of Oregon, to achieve peace.
So let's talk about Wisconsin here for a second. If you watch that video, and I'm not saying this kid should have gone down there, but that is what people do. I mean, it's crazy that the left is...
we were just talking about it, right?
Yeah.
So people show up because they don't see the government doing their job, and it offends them. And so they show up to help out their fellow Americans.
Right. And isn't this...
do those kinds of things.
Isn't this just what happened in Charlottesville? I mean, the Nazis were there, and the left decided to show up to stop it, and that caused the problem. And those, of course, were the good guys, according to the media. Now somebody shows up and says, hey, we got to at least protect these businesses, etc. He's a bad guy. But that said, I wouldn't have had my son there, and I would be really upset if my kids went to that.
Right.
However, the video looks like it was self-defense, especially with all of the other videos showing this guy really trying to jump him several times. And the left is acting like like none of that matters. And they're saying, look, first-degree murder. Ken, how are they charging this kid with first-degree murder?
Well, first of all, they did it so quickly that you knew they were just slapping on a charge. And remember, the standard to charge is much lower than to convict. I would be astonished if that charge weren't dramatically reduced, possibly ultimately dropped, but dramatically reduced before they go forward with it. Because in the absence of other information that we haven't seen, and one of the things about having all this public video, it can be a little chaotic, but it does give everybody at least some window into what happened. And, you clearly, as you've said, Glenn, see this kid and his lawyer broadcast, they're going to defend on self-defense.
They should.
And you have a right to defend yourself. The real question, I think, that the whole thing will come down to is the amount of force used. Was it appropriate under the circumstances? And I think that's what the whole thing will turn on. And if a jury finds that it was a legitimate use of force, meaning the using a gun was appropriate under the circumstances, then he will not end up being convicted of anything under those circumstances.
So let's go back to Portland. The press is making this guy who lost his life as, a guy who was inciting violence. Ken, doesn't it look like an execution? Is there a defense for somebody, saying, hey, I don't agree with you, and just even forcefully, I don't agree with you, but not having a weapon and then somebody just pulling out a gun and just shooting you?
Yeah, see, when you've got, if it's one-on-one, we don't have nearly the kind of video coverage that we do of the Kenosha situation that you and I were just talking about. So the facts surrounding what actually happened are much less certain here. And but one of the factors, if this is a one-on-one situation, is an armed person and an unarmed person. That's with my Captain Obvious cape on, right? But that's a factor here, and it also raises the question of malevolence. To your point, was this premeditated in some way? And that is still, a long way off from being resolved. That one's going to be, in many ways, murkier and more difficult to investigate, I think, than the Kenosha case, in part because there's so much video in the Kenosha situation. Whenever you have video of violence, you need to understand the context and you need to be able to know what happened before and sometimes after. But at least you have it. It becomes a baseline to analyze the facts. And, I don't have the luxury, like people outside of federal government and the state government that's responsible for this, of going too far down the road of potential conclusions. The restraint we have to show in talking about this impairs our ability to address the particular situation. I will say that the indications where you have two groups facing off like this, and some of them randomly, just, okay, rallies are over, we're walking out. And some people may go picking fights with others who don't agree with them. That is all invited by the kind of path this mayor and governor have encouraged. They haven't merely allowed it, they've encouraged it. And it's really quite extraordinary that an entire state would allow this to go on like this. And undoubtedly, Glenn, you saw the governor's, quote, plan, unquote, for resolving the violence in Portland, relying on surrounding law enforcement sheriff's offices, and they declined to enter. And one of the most outstandingly written letters that I have seen in a very long time was by one Washington County sheriff nearby, I think it was Washington County, who said, I want peace, I'll help analyze social media, I'll do these other things to help at a distance, but without the political support and without the prosecutions being undertaken, and I cannot put my deputies in that kind of danger, in that sort of, and the most interesting phrase was something along the lines of legally questionable situation, meaning you won't protect them.
Right.
You won't protect them.
Right.
I have an obligation to my own deputies to not put them in those situations. And I think that sheriff was absolutely right. This mayor and this governor have all the tools they have ever needed to bring peace to Portland tomorrow, and yet they refuse to do it. So this is a decision on their part that somehow the violence is politically preferable to them than the alternative. And I've said, with the mayor's response to the president's most recent letter, this mayor hates President Trump more than he loves the people of Portland, that he's responsible to protect, not just represent, but he's the chief of police too, but to protect. And he is failing intentionally in that obligation.